So let's get right to it. I'm going to assume that if you are watching the second video, in the first video you thought, hey, I want to learn how to pull from files and send to files for my game, and so I'm going to do the type along so that I can make use of those that game module. So here I've given you some starter codes. You want to pull that from my website, and here's what it's going to look like. I'm not going to run the finished version because that's in the first video, and you'll see that at the end of this video. This video is going to be relatively long because it's going to take us a while to kind of fix things up and get everything working. So here's the first panel. It should have first name and last name. I'll enter my name Herbert and go to the next panel, and then this would be the question panel. It's not really working. I can't get to the next panel. There is a last panel that is the high scores panel, and that's all that is showing. So there's quite a bit of kind of fixing that we need to do. Again, relatively long video, and I'm assuming you're doing this because you want to use an idea like this in your game, so you're willing to type along and get things set up. All right, let's see what we have. So we've got all of the imports that we need, all kinds of good stuff here. We've talked about these things before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. There is a main, right? So it's got a size, etc., and it's going to call the card for game module file. So we have a card layout, and the first card is that start panel. We're going to ask for first name, last name, and then we're going to hit the next panel button. And the questions panel will show the questions, so the questions and then 4 possible answers, and then a little button panel at the bottom, and then a high scores panel. From the high scores panel, you can either exit the game or you can go back and play the question part of the game again, and you can repeat that again and again, adding to the high scores text file. And I've got a high scores text file here where I'm starting out with some names, and then we've got a whole list of questions as well. All right, so as you saw in the first time I ran it, in this start panel, there is a panel for first names, but there isn't one for last names. And these are going to be flow layouts, right? Overall, there's a grid layout with 3 rows and just 1 column. But we'll have a first name panel, and then we're also going to want a last name panel. And those will have these first name field and last name field that we'll use later in an action performed method. So why don't we just take that first name panel, that block, right? Because there's the panel, and we're adding a label, JLabel, and then a text field. And we're going to do almost exactly the same thing with the last name. So we'll copy that and we'll paste it. And instead of calling this first name panel, we'll call this last name panel. It's another J panel. And then we're going to have the same background color. We're going to have the same flow layout. And then we're going to add it to that start panel. And then instead of the first name prompt, we'll have a last name prompt. And it'll say first name. No, it'll say last name. So we have that prompt. We're going to use the same size font that was created earlier. It's going to be Tahoma and 22, size 22 in bold. And we're going to add that to the last name panel. So last name panel, and we'll add the last name prompt. Okay, so so far we're just kind of copying the same thing that's done in the first name panel for the last name panel. Now it's time for the last name field. So same size as the first name field. We're going to have some insets so that there's a little bit of space, a little breathing room. And then we're going to set the same font, and then we're going to add it to the last name panel. So we just worked on these kind of 3 blocks, and it looks a lot like the first name panel, the first name prompt, and the first name field, but it's just for last names. So let's see if that'll work for us. Compile it, and we run it. Okay, and then we say Scott derouter, and then we can hit next panel. Now what I'd actually like to do is I'd like to be able to not enter anything, try to hit next panel and it won't go. In this case it will. It'll go, but I want to be able to add that feature. So let's do that. So we added these 3 blocks. You might take a quick look at that. Now let's go down to action performed. And so when we hit next panel, we do want to go to the next panel except if they still have some names to enter. So what we'll do is we'll say they have to hit that button and they have to have some text in the first name field. So we'll say first name field dot get text. We want to make sure that that is not equal to, so we'll say equals nothing, and then we'll put a not in front of that. And then we want almost the exact same thing for the last name field. So we'll copy that and we'll paste it, and that'll be for the last name field. So they would hit the equals button, and we would make sure that there's not an empty space in the first name field, there's not an empty space in the last name field. And let's see what happens there. So we'll recompile, rerun. If we try and just hit next panel, it's not going to let me. If I enter Fred, no, not yet, but if I enter Flint, Stone, it does. Okay, so far so good. Now we'd also like to be able to pick up the names, and as I've done in the last 2 parts of the type along, we're going to have this game data class that's going to store all of the data for the game, and then it's going to be shared between all of the classes. And so what I'll do is I'm going to, for the start panel, I'm going to pick those up. So I'm going to, before I go on to the next card, I'm going to say data.setName, and there's a method there where I'm going to pass in the first name and the last name. So we'll say first name field dot get text, and then last name field get text, and that'll pull the information, the strings from those 2 fields, and it'll pass it to my data instance, which is an instance of the game data, and it's actually set up here in the card for the primary class, and it'll set those values. If I take a look at set name down here, it's going to just take the string first and last and assign those values. So we're just going to add those, and let's make sure it compiles. And I'm just going to leave it at that because you're not going to see any difference in the output. Okay, so far so good. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to work on the questions panel. So the questions panel, it's not showing the values yet, and so I need to set up my questions panel, and in particular I need to set up the radio buttons, the J radio buttons. And so we're going to do that, and we'll put that right after the answers. So we've got this answer group is going to be a set of 4 radio buttons, and then the question is going to be up at the top. So we add that in, and then for the J panel of answers, we're going to want to add in our radio buttons. So first we'll make a group out of them, and we'll say that's equal to a new button group, and this will allow me to just choose 1 radio button at a time. And then I'm going to write a little loop for all of the radio buttons because it's part of an array, right? It's going to be an array of these radio buttons. So we're going to say for int I equals 0, I is less than the number of buttons in the array. And then we're going to set them up. So we're going to say answer at the 0th button, and then we'll move that counter on. It's a new J radio button, and we want it to either say A or B or C or D. So we'll use a little bit of trickery here. We'll say plus, and we'll use a care. We know that 65 starts with a capital A, so we'll say 65 plus I, and then we'll say plus, and then maybe we'll put a period after it, and then we'll pull the get answer from the data. So data.getAnswer. And you can scroll down to the bottom of this and see the get answer method, which is going to pull that answer. So we'll put the answer in, and then we're going to say group dot add answer at I. So this will group them together so that only one can be clicked on at a time. And then we're going to set the background. So answer I dot set background. And we'll have it relatively light. So new color. So this is relatively close to white, because white would be 255, 255, 255, so a pretty light background. And then we're going to make sure that we set the font. Let's use the font that we've already set up, which is my font, at the top of the class. And then we're going to add an action listener to each of these. As it pertains to this instance of the panel. And then we'll say answers.add. So answers is the J panel, and we're going to add each of these radio buttons to that panel. So we'll say answers at I. Okay, so this is what I've added, right? And we're hopefully going to be adding those radio buttons. Again, this block is what we just answered or added. And now let's try to compile. Let's see. And it should be data.getAnswer at I. It needs the I value. It's the particular answer. Let's try that. Okay, set background. I spelled that wrong, so set background with a lowercase g. Fix that. And then answers.add. Answer. Oh, it's answer I, not answers. All right, so let's see what that does. Okay, so we'll clear it. We'll run it. So Scott. Again, if I don't enter something, it's going to wait. Let's say this one isn't entered, but I say derouter. It won't be happy unless I enter something for each field. Okay, it picks those up and then adds those in. Okay, so at least now we have these set up. But now we need to add this. We need to make sure that we're picking things up from these spots. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add the buttons at the bottom, and then we'll come back and we'll worry about picking up these values. So we've got the next panel button, but we need the other buttons as well. We need submit and next question. So let's take care of that. So we have the next panel, but let's add in two others. So we'll have a button called submit. And so we'll say submit, submit, submit. And we'll add submit. And of course we want it to say submit. Okay, we got that. add that all in correctly. All right, and then we also want a button for the next question. So we can call that next question. So 3 buttons just lined up there. One right after the other. Let's try it. Recompile. Rerun. Again, enter a name. Next panel. All right, and things are set up for us. The radio buttons are working, right? We're not pulling from the files yet. We still need to write that part, but at least the frame is there for the index values, etc. And once I choose one, I can say submit. I'm getting some errors in the background because I haven't loaded from the files yet. But let's go on to the next part. Now, the action performed does all kinds of interesting rearranging of the buttons and whether they're enabled or not. And so you probably want to take a look at this code carefully and see how it disables buttons and enables buttons so that things happen in order, so that they choose a radio. The user will choose a radio button first before they can submit the answer. Before they go to the next question, they have to choose a radio button and submit. Before they go to the next panel, they have to answer 4 questions. So you might want to take a look at that carefully. And then we've got reset question, and this is why we're getting we're getting errors in the background because we haven't written some of these methods yet, or at least not finished them. And then there's a high scores panel, which we haven't seen yet because we can't use that button that is going to the next panel. But it shows the scores, the score info on the right hand side, and then on the left hand side, or sorry, the score info is on the left. There's some information that's going to be shown, and then the high scores from the text file, we will also want to show that. Okay, paint component I use here as a way to update information. So every time you open a new panel, paint component will be called, and so I use this to update the information that comes from the data instance for the game data. So that's, you can use, even though I'm not really doing any drawing, I'm not drawing any strings or anything, I'm using it to update as I go. Alright, so most of this is done. The game data has a first and last name. It's going to have a question string. That's what you see at the top on the second panel. It's got 4 possible answers. The number of the correct answers, 0, 1, 2, 3, is recorded. And then we make sure that we don't repeat any questions by keeping a Boolean array within the 4 that are asked. If you play the game again, it might repeat a question, but at least as you're playing for the 4 questions, they won't be repeated. And then we're going to keep track of the question count, and then we want to know how many we got correct, and then the last game how many we got correct, so that we can choose a high score. Okay, this is the constructor is just setting everything, and you can reset all the numbers if you're going to play the game again. All right, here's the spot though where we're going to grab a question from a file, and this is done as the game is loaded up at the top. That's done, grabbing a question from a file, and then it's going to be done again when you're resetting a question. You're getting a new question. So what we need to do here is we need to open a text file for reading, and then we need to pull a random question from this list. So I'm going to steal from read and write, which we did together, and you might need to type this up, and I'm going to have to type some of this up. But we've done some of this work before. So we're going to read strings from a file. It's very similar to what we did in read and write. So I'm going to steal from that. And you might need to type more of this up than I'm going to have to. But we're going to set that up. We will need to declare the scanner in file. Maybe start with it being null. And then the file we're going to open is not my file. It's computer questions.txt. And then we're going to open that up for reading. And it's possible that it doesn't exist, so we hope it exists in the folder where we're working. And then we're going to read things in, and we're going to choose a question number at random. Remember, there are 30 questions here, so each question, the information will take up 6 lines, and so 6 times 30, there are 30 questions. So what we'll do here is we're going to come up with a random number even before we we'll start reading from the text file. So we'll say int question number equals, and we'll use math.random times 30. So we get a random number there from 0 to 29. That's 30 possibilities. And then we're going to start reading in from the file. So we want to make sure we don't repeat, so we're also going to say while the chosen questions chosen questions is an array here that are initially all false, but then eventually it's going to be true for some of them if they're questions that we've already chosen. We don't want to repeat chosen questions. So if chosen questions at question number is true, then I want to reset that random number. I don't want to ask the same question again in a single round of 4 questions. So we'll reset it. So there'll be some that we want to avoid some repeating. All right, and then once we have done that, then we pick something that we haven't chosen before. Well, we want to flag it as, hey, now we have chosen it. So you want to set the random question that you are picking up. You want to set that as true. And then we want to keep track of how many questions we've asked. So question count, we'll say ++. And so we're going to need to make sure that we keep track of the question count. So that's initially 0, but we're going to add to it. And then we're going to keep a counter, which is initially 0. And then we're going to go while there's still something in the file and while the counter is less than 6 times my question number. And we're going to do that because we want to skip the first 6 and the next 6 and the next 6 until we get to our question number. So we'll pick that up. String line equals infile.nextLine, and then we're not going to look at it. We're just going to add to the counter. So we'll just say counter ++. And those are effectively parts of questions that we don't need. We don't need those. So we just move on. And then once we get to the question, we're going to save it. So question now equals infile.nextLine. So we'll pick up the question, and then we're going to reset the counter to 0 again, because we're going to reuse that variable. And then we're going to read in the 4 possible answers. So we're going to say while infile.hasNext and the counter is less than 4, because there are 4 of them. And we're going to read them into our answer set. It's an array of string. So answer set at counter, and that will equal infile.nextLine. counter plus plus. And then we want to also know what's the correct answer. There's a numerical value here that tells you which one is the correct answer. So we want to pick that up also. So we'll say correct answer, correct answer equals, and this time we have to pick it up as an int. So next int. And then we close the file. All right, so we've just written this method. So you might take a kind of a careful look at this and make sure that you've got this all entered correctly. The idea is that we have to first open up the file for reading, and then we choose a random question because there are 30 of them, so we get a random number from 0 to 29. We move along, we make sure that we don't repeat any questions in the 4 questions we're going to ask. We move past all of the previous questions to get to our question number, and then we pick up the question, we pick up the possible answers, and we pick up the numerical value of the correct answer. And let's see if we can compile that and run it. Okay, so Scott D. Reuter, you can enter your own name, and now we're getting somewhere. So it picks up a string that is the question. We'll answer this correctly and say submit, and now things are working like I expect they will. Let's answer 2 of these 4 correctly. Let's say that was Steve Jobs. Okay, so it's going to highlight that that was wrong and what the right answer was. First computer program, that was Ada Lovelace. So I've gotten 2 right so far. And we'll say that this is RAM, and that's going to be wrong. And then we go to the next panel. Okay, and then we can exit or play again. And it actually doesn't write to the file yet. So it's picking up the file. That's already done for us, but it's not going to write to the file. So let's do that next. That's the last thing that we have to do. So there's already a method here that does get the high scores. So it's going to print the high scores in that panel on the right in the last panel. But we don't have one that saves to high scores. And reading and picking up the high scores is very similar to the writing to for writing to the text file. So I'm going to use some of the information here where we're getting from the high scores, and then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to print to them. So I'm going to copy this code from get high scores, and I'm going to do something that are very, very similar. So I'm only going to save to high scores if they get a high scores. So I'm going to say if, and we're storing that in what I call the last game correct count. So if last game correct count is greater than or equal to 3, then I'm going to want to do this stuff. So you should kind of tab this over if you can. And then we'll use some of this and then write some more code. So we're going to have one string that's going to keep track of things that we're going to write. We are going to open up high scores. We have to figure out where we're going to add the high score. So I'm going to have a Boolean. I'm going to add a Boolean. So Boolean has been added. And initially that's going to be false. Okay, we still need high scores. We're still going to need the end file, which is null. We're going to need to open that up. Try and catch. So we'll need all of this stuff. That's good. And then while infol.hasNext, we're going to pick up the next line. But then we're going to add to the result, but then we need to insert the high score if the, whoops, I didn't spell correct. correctly, but we're going to insert our score in the correct place. So I need to add something here as I'm creating my result. So I'm going to say, I'll pick that up, and I'll say if it hasn't been added, so has been added not. So if it has not been added, and we find that, and you'll notice that the high scores here are 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4. If I get 3 out of 4, I want my new high score to go with the 3 out of 4s. If I get 4 out of 4, I want it to go with the 4 out of 4. So I need to pick up these numbers 4 or 4 or 3 just before the hash mark. So we're going to pick that up, and we're going to parse the integer just before it. So we're going to say integer dot parse int, and we're going to pick up the character there. So we're going to need to change it to a string. So we'll say empty string plus the line we just picked up, and we'll say char at, and then we have to find the index of that slash mark. So line dot index of slash mark, and then we need to go 1 back. So we need to say -1. Okay, so we parse that, and we want that to be less than or equal to, whoops, less than or equal to our last game correct count. And if it is, we're ready to insert it. And so we would say result plus equals, and we would want our name, so we'd say first plus a space plus last plus another space plus the score, last game correct count, and then we would need a slash and a 4 because it's always out of 4, and then we would want a new line. So we're inserting the high score, the name of the person who got the high score, in the correct position so it goes with all the others. So we're picking those up. We're not quite ready to return. We're not going to return the result. This is a void method, so there's going to be no return result. We're just going to add it to the text file. So we've got that set up. And we want to make sure that we set has been added to true, because now we don't need to look to add it anymore. And we keep adding the line that we read in. And if we go through the while loop and we know that we were supposed to add it in but we never did, we need to do it again. So I'm going to copy this and just reduce it a little bit. So I'll say if we got through everything and we never added it when we should have, so if it hasn't been added, then we better do it now. Okay, good. And then we do want to make sure we close the file, so we'd say in file .close. And then one more thing to do. Now we need to send it to the file. So again, I'm going to go to read and write, and we're going to print to a file. Let's see, which one could we do? How about print, is there print strings to a file? There's print ints to a file. Let's use that one. So it's a little different, but we'll pick that up. We'll paste that in after the closing of the in file. And we are going to be sending an out file, and this is highscores.txt. So highscores.txt. We create a print writer. We try and set up the out file. We catch it if it fails for some reason. And then if we are able to send to it, we're just going to print to it. So there's no need for a for loop here. We're just going to say out file.result. And then we close the file. And then that's going to end our if. Okay, so a relatively long method that we just wrote. So the first one is we're reading from the file and creating the new string that's going to need to replace what was in the file, adding the new high score. And then we open up the file and we save the new information with that new name, new high score. So let's try that. Recompile. Whoops. Let's see, so that's on 551. It looks like I forgot to say plus here. Let's fix that. Oops, outfile dot. Oh, we want to make sure that we print. Sorry, it's print to the file. We're going to present the result. Print the result to the file, just like we would system.out.print. So we've created the string that is a result with new lines where they should go. And now let's try that. Run it. Okay, so Scott, derouter. I'm not going to run this too many times, but this is the completed expression. So we'll do it wrong. Actually, let's get a new high score with 3 out of 4. This was done in, I'm not sure. I think this was done in 47. Yep. That's Blaise Pascal. 30 page. Did that in 98. Okay, and then let's get this one wrong. So we'll say Jeff Bezos. Next panel. Okay, so that should be added in between the 4 out of 4 and the 3 out of 4. Let's play again. Let's do poorly this time. Let's get that one right. So we got 1 out of 4, but Scott derouter is there now. Let's play again. Let's get 4 out of 4. So it was called Oak. First modern computer was Conrad Zuse. C++. And then this is Monty Python's Flying Circus, and probably enough. And now we play again. Let's do it poorly. Got 1 right. Let's say the wheel. And now we got 2 high scores, right? Scott derouter, Scott derouter. If we exit, it closes the game. And now if I open up that file again, it says, hey, it's been modified and doesn't have any Scott derouters in it. And now it does. And you have a fully functioning game model. So hopefully you can use it. Cite me as a source if you do use it. Thanks.